It's interesting because the way it looks is though you get a free blessing. You know, it's like you get a free coupon for being awake. The free blessing may be that you're curious for some reason, you really don't even know why, but you're curious about this meditation, you're curious about meditation, you're curious about these teachings, right? And so for you as a personality, it's curiosity that brought you here, right? But the very first time that you got involved with this, it was like a coupon. You know what I mean? Because you didn't know, you weren't experiencing the source, right? So you got a free invitation, a free opportunity to be exposed to reality. Free coupon. But then after you get that coupon, whether or not you continue to persist in the process depends on whether or not your will or thy will takes over. We've all seen, just those of you who've been in this class since it was at the Y for the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of people come and go, haven't we? Yeah. So they used their coupon and then they left. That was it.
Yeah.
You know, and even when they use their coupon, you know, I've seen it often be the case, even when they use their coupon, they kind of get what this is and they're kind of like interested in it, right? But not enough to be committed. Not enough to stay interested, not enough to keep coming even when you don't feel like it, even when you got better things to do, not enough for any of that. You came this time because it just seemed to be convenient, but after this, you know, the next time the class occurs, we'll see. We'll see. This is very important, right? Because there is a place where this transition happens or it doesn't happen. You know, you either get to a place where you generate the commitment and the conviction or you don't. And if you generate the commitment and the conviction, what you're doing, if you understand what you're doing, is you're letting go of your will. You're letting go of your will because it's obvious that, see, this is the thing. If you really look at things as they are, you can see God's will is for everybody to wake up. Or said another way, God's will is for God to experience God, for everybody to wake up. But then you might say, well, if that's God's will, what the hell's going on? It doesn't seem like most of the people on this planet are waking up. Right? So what's God, a failure? I remember they asked Harari, right, if he believed in God, and he said, no, I'm an atheist. He said, why should I believe in God? If there's a God, he's not, whatever it is not doing too well. It's not being very successful here, so why should I believe in that, right? Well, the way it occurs to me is that that's a misunderstanding, right? Because if it is the intention of God, if it is the intention of the source to realize itself, right? If it's the intention of the source for human beings to wake up and experience what they actually are, right? How would God do that? Because everybody has to be born into the lie. Everybody has to be born into the form and the word. Everybody has to take the form of a human body in order to come into this world, right? Everybody has to take the form of a human body, and everybody has to take the form of a personality, and everybody has to learn the rules about gravity, space, time, separation. Everybody has to learn the rules of the game to play the game, right? So that's inevitable. It has to happen, right? So you come into this world in a state of purity, right? And within 2 years, you lose that purity and clarity, and you become something that you're not, right? And you start living in this game that we're playing of time and space as that's something that you're not, and then the suffering starts. So how does it work? If God is the source, or whatever you want to call it, you don't have to use the word God, you know, because the source is incomprehensible, right? And it's not conceptual, so we're just, you know, putting a word on it, but that's not it. But there is obviously something from which this is all happening, something from which this is all coming, right? And that something from which this is all coming is considered to be intelligent. In fact, it's considered to be wisdom itself, right? So the idea is that this is working. This is actually working, but do we understand how it's working? If the idea is for everybody to wake up, right? Given the situation, given the condition that's occurring here, how do we have that happen? If it was your project, how would you have it happen? You're already what you are, but you don't know that, right? And you've taken on these beliefs, right? And you've been indoctrinated into this other reality, right? And the total picture here is that this whole process is a process in which there is an awakening going on. There's an awakening occurring because that's the goal, for everybody to wake up. So how do you make sense of that, given what you see when you look around you in this world? If this was your project, how would you have everybody on the planet wake up?
What's that?
Suffering. If you were God and this was your project, you would have people suffer that weren't being what they are. That'll be the motivation. Right? That'll be the motivation. So it works. Harari's wrong. It works. You know, they don't take the next step. You know, they go back into the default state. And in the default state, this is just another interesting thing. Curiosity. This is just another interesting curiosity in the default state. Right? But then once you got in the door and you started hearing this and it started making sense to you, yeah, what sense did it make to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah. So the coupon gets you into the introduction, the invitation, as Muji says, the invitation to freedom. Right? The coupon gets you into the introduction, right? But whether in the introduction you realize what this really is, and you realize this could be the answer, the last answer, you know, that you realize this could be what allows you to, instead of suffer, be happy and satisfied and peaceful. Yeah? If you start to see that, right, then you're moving beyond the coupon. You're moving beyond the grace of God that was just a freebie, right? And when you move beyond the coupon, then it gets even more interesting, because then it becomes a question of, okay, you move beyond the coupon, right? But how convicted are you? How much of a conviction do you have of this? How committed are you to this? Yeah? Are you committed enough to this to make it a part of your everyday, not just in terms of formal meditation, but are you do you have a conviction and a commitment that's strong enough that not just in terms of formal meditation, but you're interested in learning more and deepening your understanding? You know, you want to go toward this. You know, you want to realize this. You want to experience this possibility. It's a possibility. Right? But it's an interesting thing then, because it becomes a matter of, you know, do you relate to this like a good idea or a hobby or an academic experience, right? Or do you relate to this like something that may determine the quality of the rest of your life? Yeah. I often say here that if you understand these teachings, there is nothing more important. There's nothing more important, right? So there's a process there in which you use the coupon, then you see the possibility, right? Once you see the possibility, then it becomes a question of now you're involved in the process of whether your personality or your true nature determines your behavior, aren't you? Now you're involved in that possibility, right? And if you pay attention, what you're learning to do through meditation, you're paying attention. What are you paying attention to? You're paying attention to, in your moment-to-moment existence, which one are you? In your moment-to-moment existence, which one are you? Because if you experience not being the personality for a few moments, like resting as awareness for a brief moment, in that brief moment, you're free. Right? But then you go back, the rubber band will bounce back to your being in the contracted state in the personality again, right? So in that moment, you're free, but it's going to bounce back to that other reality, right? And really what it boils down to is that in order for you to be absolutely free, every moment of your existence has to be a moment that you choose to be the truth. Every moment of your existence has to be a moment that you choose to be the truth. Because if you don't choose to be the truth, you will automatically be the default state. So your personality is what's playing all the time. That got started, you got indoctrinated to that, educated in that, and identified with that. And that's playing all the time, right? So to interrupt it briefly may give you a nice taste, but it's not going to redefine your life if you just interrupt it briefly. Right? So then the question becomes, are you really willing to take on the challenge, right, of being awake? Because if you're really willing to take on the challenge of being awake, it means you've got to pay attention every single moment of your life. You've got to pay attention every single moment of your life. And you've got to be willing to experience the fact that even though you know the truth and you're experiencing moments of that freedom, right, that you will have to go back into being the personality and have that control you. You will have to go back into that because that's it's still the dominating programming.
You have to use the programming to be in the world too, though, right? So then
That's right.
the danger is letting that take over again. But you have to use it.
You have to do the body thing and you have to do the personality thing. If not, we have to put you in the mental hospital. Right? But now you know the truth. So now you know the truth, and yet even though you know the truth, you have to find yourself in the form of the personality in the physical body, behaving as if that's the truth. Yeah. You have to find yourself in that place. How do you find yourself in that place? By paying attention. If you identify with it, you won't see it. If you identify with it, you're unwittingly being it. In other words, you don't know you're being it, right? If you identify with it, you're unwittingly being it. So the practice is the practice of paying attention so that you can see what's happening with clarity. And if you can see what's happening with clarity, you can see when you're in the personality, even if you can't do anything about it. This is very important, right? Because what happens, people will find themselves in the personality and they can't do anything about it and then they give up. That's what happens more than not for people, right? People that will come to this class, they've got an investment, but not 100%. They have a conviction, but not 100%. They have a commitment, but not 100%, right? So you're leaving space for the personality to play. You're leaving space for the personality to operate, right? And then when it does operate and you feel helpless about it, that it's controlling your mouth and your behavior, right? Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, they say, well, this doesn't work. This doesn't work because I find myself getting angry again. I find myself being afraid again. I find myself acting stupid again and hurting other people. So this isn't the solution. That's because they don't understand. Part of the solution is being aware when you're crazy. That's part of the solution. That will take you to the next step, right? By paying attention to how you're being destructive, how you're being negative, how you're undermining the quality of your own life, how you're undermining the quality of other people's lives. That's not an easy thing to do, to watch yourself be crazy, to watch yourself be out of control, to watch yourself be doing damage to you, your body, and other people. That's not fun to watch, right? I want to go back to sleep, right? That's what happens for people when they get a taste of the truth. It's like, oh shit, now I got to be aware of myself being crazy instead of just being crazy. But that's part of the process. That's part of a necessary process because you can't go. I don't even believe with somebody like Eckhart Tolle that had a spontaneous awakening. I don't believe that after he had that spontaneous awakening that his personality just disappeared. No. He had that spontaneous awakening, and part of that awakening is you better pay attention moment to moment now or you'll be right back in the shit. That's the practice, is to pay attention from moment to moment, right? But in the beginning of the practicing paying attention to moment, you can't do it. Your attention isn't strong enough to do it, right? So you'll lose your attention. Your attention will be taken again by your thinking and your feelings in the situation, and then you'll behave according to that, and then you'll feel disappointed and frustrated. Okay? But if you understand, held in the context of the whole process, that's just part of the necessary process, that's all. To be aware of, You know, so to be aware of your being crazy and not to be able to do anything about it means that you're acting crazy and you're talking crazy as a personality. You're following your anger, you're following your fear. You're acting crazy and you're talking crazy. And it's very disappointing. So now you're angry, fearful, and disappointed too, and frustrated too, right? But the next step, if you stay in the process and you stay committed to the process and you understand that it will work if you stay in the process, right? The next step in the process is I'm crazy and I feel crazy and I'm having crazy thoughts and crazy feelings, but I'm able to control not acting it out anymore. So I'm not doing harm. That's the first step. Right? So I'm not doing harm anymore, but I still feel crazy, but I'm not doing harm anymore because I'm not letting it use my mouth. Yep. Right? Then if you stay in that process, now you're not acting it out, so you have some benefit of that. You know, you stop doing damage, you know, people stop being in conflict with you, you know, because you're acting more kindly, you're acting more consistent with your true nature and so forth, right? But you still feel crazy and you're still having crazy emotions and crazy thoughts and, you know, all the rest of it, right? Crazy memories, crazy imagination of the future and the whole 9 yards. But if you stay the process, if you keep going and you keep practicing and you keep deepening your experience, keep deepening your understanding, right? Then it gets to the point where the craziness starts to dissipate. And you start feeling calmer, you start feeling more peaceful, you start feeling happier, you start feeling more satisfied. So now the difference is made in and out, right? But to get to that, there's no way to get to that except to go through this process. And the process is challenging, and the process can very easily be misinterpreted to mean that the truth isn't true. It can be very easily misinterpreted to mean that the truth isn't true. So when you look at it, the question is an individual reality because all our conditionings are different, right? See, in my case, I was actually fortunate because I came from a family that wasn't far from the animal world. I came from a family where there was a lot of neglect, very little attention, very little real warmth and kindness, right? My parents were too busy hating each other to bother with us. That was a full-time job, hating each other, right? But that was a benefit to me, right? Because I didn't have that, right? I had to search for some other way, something else to connect to, but I didn't have that. So what's negative turns out to be positive. The worst things that happen in your life turn out to be the best things that happen in your life because they forced you to look for an answer, right? They forced you to seek some relief somewhere, right? And because you're seeking some relief somewhere, the probability of coming across these teachings goes up, doesn't it? Because you're looking, you're searching, right? So then you come upon this and you have the opportunity to take this on. You have the opportunity to make this a commitment for your life. And you express that commitment by coming to class. You express that commitment by reading material that's consistent with the truth. You express that commitment by watching videos. You know, I was thinking about this today in terms of what does the psychotherapeutic process look like when the foundation of it is the truth? Right? And I'm learning that, right? Because I was trained. My training was to deal with the person as a personality. So I wasn't trained at all in how to use the truth as a way of doing psychotherapy, right? So I started looking at that today and I started realizing, oh, okay, what I should do is whenever I take somebody on for psychotherapy, I should tell them in the very beginning that this is the way this works. Part of this is that you watch the videos of this class. That's part of the treatment, that you watch the videos of this class. It's part of the treatment that you read certain books. You know, that's part of the psychotherapy, right? Psychoeducation, right? That you read certain books. And make it clear to people, if you're not willing to do that, go see somebody who's doing the other thing. Yeah. You know? Because if I get people involved in my process that think I'm doing the other thing, they're going to be confused. Right? Because I'm not interested in changing the way you think. I'm interested in changing who you take yourself to be. It's a different subject, right? So it's very important to understand that the source of suffering, what's the source of suffering?
Unmet expectations.
No.
Thinking.
Wanting things,
No.
wanting things to be different than they are.
No.
Ignorance.
The personality.
No. Well, you're getting close. The source of suffering. This is very important to understand, right? Because you can get off into some other tangent and lose your way, right? The source of your suffering is your identity. That's the source of the suffering. Everything else you said comes after that, right? How you think comes after your identity, right? How you behave comes after your identity. How you feel comes after identity. So the source of suffering is your identity. So what are you practicing? You're practicing your identity. You're practicing being who you really are instead of the identity that you've taken yourself to be, right? That can never work because it's not real. Can never work because it doesn't exist. Can never work because it can never provide a quality of life. You can never be happy as a personality. You can never be satisfied as a personality. You can never have peace of mind as a personality. So it's an identity crisis, you know? If you get involved in these teachings and practices, you should generate an identity crisis for yourself. You should generate one, right? You should generate one. You should generate an identity crisis because you know that if I allow the automatic identity to keep playing, it's going to ruin my life. So it's an identity crisis. It really is. Yeah? But if you don't see that and you're living only in the personality, you don't see the crisis. You don't see the crisis. You don't see the issue is with you. You think the issue is with the world and other people, don't you? Because you have an ad-effect life. You have a life that is determined by circumstances. You have a circumstantially determined existence. You have a circumstantially determined existence, which means if it's not working, it's not me, it's the circumstances. If it's not working, it's my partner. If it's not working, it's my children. If it's not working, it's my parents. If it's not working, it's my money. Huh?
It's never my fault.
It's not your fault. You didn't ask to be born.
Right.
You got thrown into this mess, right? And then you have to make it work somehow. You have to make it work somehow as something that you're not. Good luck. Right? Something that you're not. And that something that you're not sees everything circumstantially. If I'm not happy, I start looking at my circumstances, don't I? If I'm not happy, why am I not happy? Maybe it's not enough money. Maybe I live in the wrong place. Maybe, you know, the person I'm married to is a mistake. So I got to keep changing things, right? See, but what happens as you get older, young people are busy changing things, aren't they? They just keep changing it. You know, I got plenty of energy. I'll just keep changing it. Every time I see something works, I see something else over here that's shining and catch my attention, I'll go try that. If that doesn't work, I'll change and try something else. When you're younger, you have the energy to keep doing that, right? And you have the energy to keep believing that's the game you're playing, right? But as you get older and your energy starts to dissipate, you start realizing, wait a minute, I can't keep this up. I can't keep changing. I'm getting...
It's not working.
Well, yeah, it's not working. It's not working, and I don't have the energy to keep doing it. That's what I found out about marriage. You know, it's not working, and I don't have the energy to keep doing it, right? Plus, it costs a lot of money to keep getting unmarried. But as you get older, you start to see things more clearly because you're just no longer able to keep up with the pace of it all. And so you start looking for other ways. So you start looking for other answers. And then if you come across this, right, and you really understand what it is, you have found the solution to the whole mess. And it's not a circumstantial solution. It's a solution that has to do with your identity. That's right. If you persist no matter what, you can't fail. How are you going to fail? You're already home. You're already home, so if you persist trying to get home, how are you going to fail? You're already home. Because the persistence that you're persisting with is you're persisting in paying attention to thinking that you're not home. And somebody who is invested their energy and their life to this unreal world, somebody who's invested themselves in that, if they're invested enough in that, they can't even hear what you're talking about. You know, do you ever try and talk about this to somebody? You know, they start looking at you like a dog looks at somebody, you know, when they don't.
And so I can't meditate. That's what yours here.
Yeah.
That's true.
I can't meditate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Who you take yourself to be can't meditate. Because who you take yourself to be can't do anything because it doesn't exist. It's that simple, but they can't see. If you told somebody that, they'd say you're full of shit. What do you mean I don't exist? What the hell do you think you're talking to here? It's interesting, really, when you get into it, you know, when you start to look at and start to see with clarity that this setup works. The setup works. You know, just because most of us are still stupid and sleeping, that doesn't mean that the setup doesn't work. If you're fortunate, if you're blessed enough to be in a marriage where the other person is committed to this, that's a big blessing. It's a big blessing. Well, maybe, I mean, it's in a sense, it's a big blessing, but if you look at it another way, if you're in a marriage with somebody who doesn't know anything about this or doesn't care about this at all, doesn't think it's that relevant, important, that's a blessing too, because they'll be your teacher.
Yeah, for sure.
They'll be your teacher. They'll be the one that's pushing your buttons to that has you be upset and has you realize the one that's upset is not who I am. So you see, it works in both directions.
We have children for that.
Yeah, children, you know, whatever. Strangers will do just as good a job.